Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be building a fancy isolation or quarantine tank for vampire crabs. A spare tank to keep around just in case you need to separate a crab because you're having fighting problems, injuries, or if you notice you have babies. And to be 100% clear, this tank is too small to keep a group of vampire crabs in permanently, so don't get any silly ideas. I'm using a 12 litre or 3 gallon tank, which is 30 by 20 by 20 centimeters or 11.8 by 7.87 by 7.87 inches. But if you're in a rush, you can also use a plastic container or something similar. For a light, I'm using a Sinkor SideFix Small. It's a fairly inexpensive light. It's fully adjustable and comes with full Wi-Fi control, dimming, and some ramping options as well. Probably a little bit too fancy for this build, but I love the form factor and it's really easy to work with. You'll also need a heat source for the cooler months, and for this I generally like to use an 8-watt heat mat just stuck on the back of the tank somewhere. However, you won't need a filter for this build, but I'll explain a little bit on why further on in the video. For the hardscape, in this build I'm using an assortment of Seiryu stone. I have quite a bit spare and it's going to work really well for this build, but you can use whatever rocks you have. Start by building a nice feature wall along the front of the tank. Smaller stones work best for this, but I really want to use this huge piece of Seiryu stone because I like the texture and it almost covers the entire tank. Just make sure you fill in as many gaps as possible when you're doing this, because once it comes time to add the substrate, you'll appreciate going to the extra effort. When you're happy with your barrier, fill the back section where the land will be with substrate. You can use gravel, clay balls, lava rock, anything similar. Just don't use aqua soil. It's generally a little bit too acidic, which the crabs don't necessarily like. For this though, I'm going to be using some leftover gravel, which will work really well. While you're doing this, remember to build up a bit of height, as you'll need it to be a little bit higher once you start adding soil and filling up the water level. I'll show you what I mean a little bit further in the video. When the substrate is done, you can add the soil to your build. However, if you choose clay balls, lava rock, or something with quite large pieces, you'll need to add some sort of a barrier material, some weed matting, or some window screening, just to keep the soil from making its way down into the water. However, if you're using gravel or something small like that, you can just apply your soil straight on top. Remember when adding your soil to use some sort of organic soil. As long as it's pesticide free and fertilizer free, it'll work perfectly fine. As soon as you've got the soil in the tank, it's generally a good time to start adding plants, and I recently trimmed back one of my other tanks and harvested quite a lot of Boston fern runners, so I'll be using those for this tank, but you can use whatever you like. As long as your plants don't mind having wet feet and can tolerate high humidity, they'll be perfectly fine in a build like this. There's also no need to go crazy with plants, as they'll fill the space pretty quickly, and you don't want to be spending a ton of time doing maintenance on a tank. After you've added your selection of plants, it's time to start adding the ecosystem building components, so leaf litter, moss, bark, sticks, and obviously your cleanup crew. For a small tank like this, layered leaves and bark make for really cheap, effective hides, and you can also lift them up easily to catch your crab when it's time to move from isolation back over into his permanent home. My preferred leaf litter is generally oak leaves, elm, birch, beech, acacia. These are generally pretty common and easy to find, and they also work really well. For bark options, I find birch and acacia are probably the easiest ones to find. They also have a nice texture, generally have moss on them, and they also have an easy bit of a curve, which makes for great caves. And for moss, I find the best one to use, especially if you're a beginner, is Hypnum Moss. It's really tough, easy to find, and really forgiving. Just don't let it get too wet or too dry. The last part of the tank that I like to add is always the sand. I'm using just some plain old quartz sand for this, however you can use any kind of aquarium sand that you like. Pretty much anything goes, so feel free to use whatever you have spare or whatever you like the look of. When you've got your final sand layer in, you can start adding water to your tank. You want to have dechlorinated water, and you do need to meet your standard vampire crab requirements. However, you don't really need to go all that deep with your water. As long as it's enough to cover your entire crab's body, plus a little bit, that will be perfectly fine. And getting back to the filter question from earlier, we don't actually need a filter for a build like this, as we'll be using plants to do all of the work. Once the plant roots get established, they'll suck up all of the nutrients out of the water, so you won't need to worry about adding a filter. However, while we wait for that to happen, we'll be adding some salvinia to do the work in the meantime, because it does take a little bit of time for the roots of the plants to get established and to start sucking up nutrients from the water section. So that's basically our 5-star quarantine tank built. It makes for quite a nice display tank, as well as a very handy isolation or quarantine tank. But if you are in a rush and don't have any money to spare, or if you're just looking for something really cheap and quick to build, I do have a link in the description to another build you can follow. It's basically very similar, but it's just built into a container and you can put it together in about 15 minutes.